Joining me to talk through some of this week's business stories is Laura Fisayo Kolawole. She's Head of Equities and Alternative Solutions at FBN Quest Asset Management and was previously a Portfolio Manager at Barclays Wealth Management. Thanks for joining me today on the program, Laura. Good to see you.
Thank you.
So the first story I'd like us to get into is the news that Zoom is cutting about 15% of its workforce. Yahoo has also announced the same. You know, I keep saying, is this the end of tech? What are your thoughts on what is happening?
No, it's not at all. You know what? Like, when I think of tech, and especially Zoom, like Zoom more than perhaps any other tech company really became the face of the pandemic. If you remember when the pandemic started, we all couldn't go out, we couldn't do anything. Zoom became the face of work and play, right? We were all sort of video calling, things like that. Now, Zoom currently has about 8,000 workers. What happened was from the start of the pandemic, 2 years after, they hired like 3 times their staff. And it's understandable. You know, the CEO has admitted that, you know, they made mistakes. They sort of just ran out there and had to quickly sort of couple people together because they had surge in demand, and you can understand it, right? But they didn't think about the sustainability of their hiring, of their business. It was really sort of hurried performance, like hurried, you know, just putting things together just so that we can survive. What's happened now is they've obviously had some time to think about it. They feel now that their staffing is perhaps not sustainable. Obviously, demand is slowing for Zoom services year over year, so you can imagine that they're not seeing the kind of growth they were seeing earlier.
And you know, the interesting thing is their shares jumped as much as 10%. So is that a signal that investors thought that the strategy of having such a bloated workforce?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, so I think that it was such welcome news because unfortunately, I mean, obviously it's bad for the workers, but investors loved it. The stock was up 9% on the day. And it was simply because people could see that Zoom had overdone it in hiring. And to be honest, you know, as a result of sort of taking accountability, even the CEO, Yuan, he cut his salary like almost 98% or something. So basically, he's earning nothing this year. He's also cut the salaries of their leadership by 20%. He said no bonuses for all of them as a result. So they're taking sort of personal accountability for this because they understand. And then, you know, for them, they have admitted mistakes. And when you look at the tech world, we've had something like 95,000 jobs cut this year in tech.
Last year was 300,000. So.
You can imagine. So you've had the likes of like Google. I think Google came out with like 12,000 job cuts. Microsoft like 10,000. Salesforce, I think like 7,000.
Amazon 18,000.
Amazon. Like you just sort of pick a name.
Yeah. And Yahoo has actually now joined.
Right? So Yahoo, similar to Zoom, you know, they also have like 8,000 workers. Now, Yahoo, I think, have been very vocal in saying that, look, we are not just cutting stuff like everybody else because we grew too fast or we grew too quickly. And they've said, no, that's not us. We're making a deliberate move to streamline and to simplify our business because they've said that, I mean, that cut is really focused on what they call their ad tech unit. They're cutting like half the staff in that unit. And 1,000 workers are leaving this week already. So it's really like a very quick, and they're saying that that's because that unit was unprofitable. You know, if you remember, Yahoo was bought in 2021 by a private equity firm, I think Apollo Global Management, something like that. And the point of this for them was they've obviously bought this company, and their goal is how do we streamline, how do we make this company more efficient? So this is like the second year of their running the company.
And of course, investors probably making more demands in terms of their shareholders, how the company is run.
Exactly.
Well, interesting times for tech. Now, let's look at Nigeria. The January PMI drops to 53.5%. Should we be getting excited?
So actually, you know, I think that it's excellent news in a way. You know, obviously there's always two sides to every coin. But on the one hand, the number is above 50. 53.5 is a very respectable PMI number. It is lower than December. It's also the lowest in 5 months. So that obviously is the negative side of things. But when I read the news, you know, a few things that struck me as interesting was the fact that, one, companies still talked about good customer demand. And when you think about the country and all that's going on with the scarcity of the currency, of the fuel,
and all that,
just generally low income, when companies report that customer demand is still good, I think that says something very positive about the resilience of the Nigerian people.
And do we know what sectors are really underpinning that demand resilience? So
again, it is, fortunately for us, I think telecoms, technology are really the two areas that are really pushing the economy. And so those two areas, agriculture as well, is also a mainstay in our economy. And so that has really helped our general resilience, general customer demand. There was also a lot of work for companies. They talked about trying to get projects completed. So a lot of construction was going and trying to get them completed. I don't want to say before the election.
Like a mad rush before the shutdown.
Well, I mean, so what they said was sort of coming into the end of the year, starting the year, they want to complete projects. But then, you know, obviously you can't ignore that there's an election in February. Maybe they just want to get their books tidied up and their projects, you know, completed before then. So, you know, so that was, it was a good thing, I think. I quite liked the reading, you know. The one fly in the ointment was inflation. Obviously, we're all feeling inflation. And the companies did talk about the fact that everything from staffing costs to cost of raw materials are putting pressure on them. And well, they're just passing on to customers.
Yeah. I mean, it's always good to get a bit of good news. We know the challenges that still face Nigeria as an economy. To another economy on the other side of the planet, people generally come on this show and never do Australia, but you braved it. You went, Australia has raised interest rates a 10-year high.
10-year high, I mean, 9th time in a row.
Since 2012, I think. Yes.
You know, like, when you look at the globe, the likes of the US and, to be honest, everybody's dealing with inflation. So there's nothing new there. But a lot of the countries, the developed countries especially, because they have raised rates so dramatically over the last year, they've started seeing disinflation. They've started seeing inflation slowing down, but not Australia. You know, those guys are still going through it. So what we have in Australia is a situation where they've had to move rates for the 9th consecutive time. When we started 2022, their interest rates was 0.1%. That was an all-time low.
Yeah.
And they've come to 3.35%. They've just been going consecutively, you know, for nine consecutive times. And that's because, unfortunately for Australia, their inflation is being driven by domestic demand. So when you look at their inflation reading, it is areas like travel, it is accommodation, you know, it is general domestic activity, it is restaurants.
Services.
The cost of those things, and those things are being driven by demand from the people. And so what the RBA is trying to do, the Reserve Bank of Australia is trying to do is say, look, we need to really cool down demand. And the IMF actually agrees with them. So the IMF did an Australia report, and they said 3 things. 1, Australia's growth is actually higher than their long-term trend. So their output gap is positive. It talks about the fact that Australia is dealing with a very tight labor market, which means that a lot of people have jobs. A lot of people have jobs. And so that is
also boosting demand and keeping consumer spending.
Exactly. And so keeping inflation high. And so they actually came out to say that they think that the central bank will have to sort of keep raising rates and keep monetary policy tight. And the central bank sort of came and said, look, we completely agree.
Okay.
We are going to keep raising rates, and we're going to keep raising rates until inflation falls to our target. As I said, inflation 7.8. Their target is 2 to 3%. So you can imagine that they've got a long way to go.
They've got a long way to go. But it's also good to see that alignment between the IMF and some of the world financial and a domestic economy like Australia. You don't often get that alignment. You know, one of the drivers of demand locally in Australia is Chinese visitors. And scoot over to China. Fitch has actually upgraded, I think, some positive signals in China. Is this kind of the end of the tight COVID controls, or what trends are we seeing in that economy?
It is. So China obviously came out to start this year and ended their zero COVID policy. Now, for much of the world, to be honest, we kind of all let COVID go and sort of moved on and allowed the world to, you know, allowed our economies to reopen and to leave COVID behind. But China had this strange policy of zero COVID, meaning that we're going to keep locking down and keep the economy closed until we see zero COVID, which is obviously very hard to do, and they have admitted and you've seen that, look, that's just not going to work for us. And so they've reopened. Now, the Chinese reopening is probably one of the biggest drivers of global growth positivity this year. In China, we're then seeing as a result of that, consumption has picked up dramatically, you know, travel has picked up dramatically. General economic activity has also picked up. When you look at their manufacturing PMI that came out in January, now the PMI is an excellent indicator of forward activity because it really is just businesses talking about what they're seeing in their industry. So it's a good forward indicator of growth. Their manufacturing PMI came in at 50.1. It was 47 in December. So that is a move to expansionary territory. So businesses were already feeling that positivity.
And do you see, that's really an important point, because China is sort of a global manufacturing and supply chain hub. And, you know, many of the world's economies who are dependent on that value chain were a bit concerned. So do you see that potentially having an impact on predictions of a recession in some of the world's economies? I
do think so. So I think that the Chinese reopening really picks up a lot of the world. And you mentioned the link between China and Australia. And I do believe that the Chinese reopening is one of the things that will be driving Australia's inflation, for example, because as I mentioned, Australia talked about the fact that they're having issues with accommodation prices going up, things like that. Because when you start having Chinese visitors coming back, you know, general tourism, all those things, exports to the world. Although I would say that Fitch did mention that one of the, I guess, flies in the ointment of Chinese growth is the rest of the world.
Yes.
So because obviously
demanding
China is a big,
places like America and Europe. Yes.
It's a big export market. You know, it's a huge export market. I mean, we all know that China really feeds the rest of us with goods and services. And so the fact that growth is slowing in Europe and the US is one of the things that actually made Fitch a little bit concerned about the sustainability of Chinese growth. I mean, China is really trying to rebuild its growth pillars. In 2021, China grew by 8.4%. You know, so that's kind of where China is coming from. And the idea is, how do they grow and get back to posting growth numbers of 5, 6, 7%? And that's really what the government of China is trying to maneuver.
Achieve,
especially because, you know, the second fly, if you're going to think about it, is really their property market.
Yes.
Because despite the fact that the government has given more financing to the sector, despite the fact that they've tried to support the sector a lot, we haven't seen an improvement in housing starts. We haven't seen an improvement in growth.
And there's been actually a rise in mortgage defaults in the Chinese market.
Exactly. And that's unfortunate because that sector is a quarter of Chinese market, of Chinese GDP. So if you have a problem there, it actually is a big problem for China. So that's something that, you know, or two things, I guess, that Fitch is watching. But overall, I think the Chinese reopening is positive for all of us. And for the world, and really for where global growth.
Interesting.
Growth is.
You mentioned the real estate market in China. So I guess there'll be more policy measures needed to shore up that sector. But the contagion between China and the rest of the world is really interesting because the rest of the world is trying to curb inflation. So that's having an impact on domestic demand, but even demand for Chinese exports. So the policies around monetary policy and interest rate rises, inflation targeting other parts of the world may actually then kind of neutralize the effect of what we're seeing in China ultimately.
Maybe, but you know, don't forget that China has a huge domestic market as well, and a big portion of Chinese GDP is actually Chinese people themselves, and domestic demand and consumption, and so that's why, despite the fact that, you know, external demand is slowing and may be an issue, I don't think it's enough to sort of discount,
of course,
the local demand. I mean, China is like
it's a huge market.
So of course, huge market.
Underlying resilience there, and I think that's probably a lesson for many of our African economies in terms of boosting domestic demand. Well, Laura, we could continue the conversation. So great to have you on the show. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.